The Frederick Douglass Award is for extraordinary achievement in the advancing of freedom and progress. Past recipients include Betsy DeVos, Doug Ducey. This year's recipient is Alex Azar, otherwise known as Warp Speed Al. We'll have more on his background from Avik. Please welcome and thank Alex Azar to the stage with Avik Roy.
As Jonathan said, we started this award last year as a way of recognizing extraordinary leadership in advancing freedom and progress. And why did we do that? There are obviously a lot of awards in our world that people are honoring people for various things. We thought the way to make an award that was distinctive and useful and valuable was to really highlight the people who are using freedom to advance progress, right? Which is the whole theme of our conference, to show that there are people out there who are actually achieving the things that may seem very difficult, may seem very hard. And really, what former HHS Secretary Alex Azar did in the previous Trump administration with Operation Warp Speed was incredible. And I really mean that. When I say incredible, the literal meaning of the word, meaning unbelievable. As you know, at FREOPP, we did a lot of work on COVID, on how to unlock the economy and reopen schools during the pandemic, because we were really worried. There were a lot of people at that time, in the spring of 2020, saying, well, we have to keep the economy closed until there's a vaccine, because otherwise it's too dangerous to reopen the economy. And we put out a paper showing that the average small business had 29 days of cash, meaning every small business, or half the small business in America, would go bankrupt within 1 month. We didn't have, the previous record for developing a vaccine had been 5 years for a novel virus. 5 years. We didn't have 1 month to keep the economy functioning for small businesses. So how were we going to solve this problem? Well, one way to do it was to reopen as much of the economy and society as prudentially possible during the pandemic. But what Alex Azar decided to do was say, no, who cares if the previous record for getting a vaccine to market is 5 years? We're going to do it in 10 months. And he worked with a group of innovative companies to do just that. They had a prototype really actually by January, February of 2020, and by December it had been approved by the FDA after clinical trials that were done in an accelerated way, but in a scientifically sound way, alongside an innovative approach to fronting the costs and the upfront risk of manufacturing and R&D for these vaccines. And I mention all this to say that what the secretary did was there was no playbook for it. There was no previous administration that had to do something like this. He had to use his previous private sector experience. Secretary Azar had been previously the US president of Eli Lilly. So he knew a lot of the players in the pharmaceutical industry, and he was able to develop a public-private partnership that was not at all inevitable. It was something that actually took an enormous amount of talent. And if you don't believe me, read the book that Paul Mango wrote called Warp Speed, about all of the decisions and all of the risks and all the collaboration and all the talent that went into building that vaccine, getting it to market, and getting it to a point where it could save hundreds of thousands of lives. So it was an incredible achievement. And it helped so many people who didn't have the ability to work off their laptops get back to work and be part of our economy again. And that's why I have the distinct honor of congratulating Secretary Alex Azar for the 2024 Frederick Douglass Prize.
Thank you. Thanks to FREOPP, thanks to you, Jonathan. So good to see you again. It's actually quite meaningful to me to not only to get an award from Avik, for whom I've got just the greatest respect. We've worked together now for 7, 8 years, I think, almost. But also to get an award named in honor of Frederick Douglass. I'm from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, so I actually grew up just miles from where he was a slave, where he was actually put on sale at the Talbot County Courthouse, where he escaped from eventually. And then my mentor is one of them is Justice Clarence Thomas, and Justice Thomas, his hero is Frederick Douglass. Just again, the embodiment of that spirit of freedom that FREOPP and this award are talking about. So it really means a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and it means a lot to us. And I think it's been, I think we're off to a great start between you and Betsy DeVos and Doug Ducey. I think we are really on track with what we're trying to do with this award. And Frederick Douglass is a really amazing guy. One of these years we have to do a special session about him, because
take a trip up to Cedar Hill. If you haven't been to his house up in Anacostia, it's a national park, really an amazing thing to go to.
I mean, he's almost like a 19th century founding father. He was that important to the Republic. Incredible guy. Well, one thing I want to highlight before we get into the meat of our conversation here is it's often seen as a cliche that there's a sacrifice involved in public service. But a guy like you are a very prominent pharmaceutical industry executive prior to serving as secretary. Of course, you had been deputy HHS secretary under George W. Bush. But you actually took a major financial hit to join the Trump administration. And tell the people about that.
Oh, I don't cry for me, Argentina. But so I was president of Lilly USA, which is half of the global company Eli Lilly, and it was not at that time the smashing global success that it is today. And whenever I left, and then you're becoming secretary, you can't hold on to Lilly stock when you're the secretary of HHS. I think I got rid of everything at $62 a share. Last time I checked, Lilly is at $950 a share. So if I had just gone hunting and fishing for the last 7 years, life would have been really good. But you know what? And I should have mentioned this. It's great, and I really appreciate getting this award, but this award is not for me. It's for the whole team that was Operation Warp Speed, with Secretary Esper and the whole Defense Department team and all the people at HHS and the people from the private sector who we leveraged who came in, including people like Moncef Slaoui. He was the head of global R&D at GSK, and he came in to be our Oppenheimer, our scientific director. To do that, he had been on the board of a little company called Moderna, and he had to walk away from that and give that up. That man probably sacrificed $1 billion to serve his country for I think we had to pay him $1, and got nothing but abuse for conflict of interest, whatever else. And I mean, just the amazing sacrifice that people make for their country. And he's not, and I can assure you, Moncef was not doing it for political reasons.
Right.
If anything, the opposite.
Yeah, that's it's important for people to know these stories, because that's not a story that gets written, right? But there is a sacrifice involved in public service, and you did it twice. You worked as deputy HHS secretary for Bush, and then, as I mentioned, secretary obviously for Trump. Tell us about this. As I mentioned, this book, Paul Mango's book, which I really thought was super compelling, because it just showed how many unconventional and uncertain decisions you had to make, where you really had to rely on, taking risks, but careful risks. Tell us about that. Tell us about the thought process, because again, I think 9 out of 10 presidential administrations faced with the same set of facts and crisis would not have been able to accomplish what you accomplished.
Yeah, and part of this was the difference in decision making. So I worked in the Bush administration and the Trump administration, and just obviously a little different. Just even from decision making style. So in a Bush administration, an Obama, a Biden administration, going to be very formalistic, process driven, like corporate, traditional, highly matrixed, formal processes to get a decision made. So if you wanted to create an Operation Warp Speed, you would have to start with an idea, then a policy coordinating council, then it would go to a deputies committee, then to a principals committee, and then you might get to the president. Every step of the way, one person could kill it, one veto at every step of the way. And frankly, that process often saves you. That process can be helpful. It leads to quality decision making, make sure good inputs get into things, but it also can be sclerotic and risk averse. Trump, on the other hand, very dynamic, direct access. I mean, there are days I talk to him 3 to 4 times in a day, 7 days a week. Very accessible. And that meant decision-making could be quite fast. And so we were able to make the decision to do Operation Warp Speed really on a dime without people having veto rights. And in fact, the condition that we all said was we're going to report directly to the president on this so that, because I couldn't have Moncef Slaoui or Gus Perna sitting in meetings with junior White House staff for 3 hours a day and getting hauled to 2-3 hour press conferences every night. We wouldn't get their job done. So we had to isolate them, let them focus. But then we had to have the courage to make big bets. Now, for me, it was not terribly hard to make the bet because my concept was whatever I talked to the team at the beginning of April, and we were looking at 5-year type timelines. I said to the team, listen, we just spent $2 trillion on COVID relief money, so literally any amount of money we spend to get vaccines or therapeutics faster will have an infinite return on investment. We could not spend enough money where we wouldn't have an infinite return on investment by pulling forward vaccines or therapeutics. So that's one. Two, if the Russians or the Chinese get a vaccine before we do, that could literally change the global strategic balance of power for decades. Because back then, we, of course, were still learning what the impact would be on troops for sort of force protection. I mean, it ends up, youth don't have as much risk, but back then you didn't know. And so when I called my cabinet colleagues, most important of which was Mark Esper, to say that he's basically, you had me at hello.
Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, Secretary of Defense. And that was critical. His buy-in, he literally said, Alex, let's do it this way. You and me, we co-chair this. You've got the brains, we've got the brawn. And you have the entire Department of Defense at your disposal. I worked in the Bush administration. I can assure you, Don Rumsfeld, God bless him, but those words would not have come out of his mouth. Listen, HHS, listen, we're very important. We're the third of the U.S. government. We'd be the 6th largest nation on earth if it were based on money. But we're the JV cabinet. We're sort of at the bubble. JV to varsity right there. DOD is the varsity. And, secretaries of defense, even taking a call from a secretary of HHS is not always a given, but not with Secretary Esper. And so what I said to the team was, and I don't know why I used this framing, I said, take money off the table. I will get any amount of money. I'll find it or get Congress to give us any amount of money we need. Be limited only by the laws of science and physics, essentially only what's physically possible. And then I'm a historian type person. I said, we're going to build this on a Manhattan Project platform. So we're going to design this exactly the way the Manhattan Project was done. We're thinking about leadership roles the same way. Literally, Gus Perna was Leslie Groves, Matt Damon. And so he was the head of U.S. Army Materiel Command, 4-star general, similar position to what U.S. Grant had in the Civil War before rising up. We got Moncef Slaoui, who, as I said, had been head of R&D at GSK and brought 14 vaccines across the finish line in 10 years. He knew how to develop drugs and get them approved by the FDA. And then another fellow who doesn't get as much mention, Carlo Di Notari Stefani, another hero. He had been the head of global manufacturing at Bristol Myers Squibb and at Teva. So he knew how to manufacture. And this is probably one of the key insights I brought to the table, having been from Lilly, is it doesn't do you any good to invent a drug. It doesn't do you any good to get a drug approved by FDA if you cannot manufacture it at scale. And manufacturing proteins is not beanbag. It's more art than it is science, because you're talking in many cases about living organisms that you have to grow in basically a bioreactor. You have to figure out what the feeder cell lines are, E. coli, Chinese hamster ovary. You have to figure out what the nutrient line is. You have to figure out how to cultivate the right yields. And you have to figure out how to filter, get pure and potent out of that. This is stuff people with 5-6 decades of experience struggle with. And so we pre-funded everything. We basically said, we're going to take risk off the table. We're going to fund all stages of development up front. We're going to invest in multiple types of vaccines. We're going to invest in multiple candidates within each type of vaccine. We're going to stand up a US-based manufacturing capacity, and we're going to start manufacturing. We were making hundreds of millions of doses of vaccine in June of 2020 so that it'd be ready. And then we bought up a large part of the world's supply of needles, glass vials, syringes, so that we'd be ready, for one of a nail, a kingdom was lost. Doesn't do you much good to have vaccine in a bioreactor. Got to be able to administer it. And guess where most of the needles in the world are made? China. Where do you think most of the glass vials in the world are made? China. Where are all the nitrile gloves made in the world made? Now, trick question, Vietnam.
When did you know or when did you feel like you were reasonably certain that you had a viable vaccine?
You know, it's funny. I teach down at the University of Miami in the business school, and we'll talk to the students a lot about Operation Warp Speed. And at the end of one of the classes, a student, she said, what would you have done if none of the 6 vaccines you all had invested in had hit? And I looked out and I said, you know, I actually didn't think about that. I mean, it wasn't, you know, we had, of course, done our Monte Carlo probabilizations. And so we knew we had that with the 6 bets and the way we had funded them, we knew we had a very high likelihood of technical success. We did not know how long that would take, because with these clinical trials, you have no idea when you'll get the results. And we had no idea if the manufacturing would work. I mean, look at Novavax. I mean, the Novavax vaccine took years to eventually get the manufacturing processes to be able to produce that. So a lot of uncertainty, but I guess maybe as a leader, you sort of put the blinders on and charge ahead with just unflinching confidence it'll happen. I called Paul Mango and he said, don't worry, we were thinking about what would happen. But it's, I think the combination, some of the reasons to believe, we had a vaccine, Avik referred to this, on January 13th. So January 10th, a Chinese researcher posted the genetic sequence for COVID. We grabbed it. On January 13th, the NIAID had actually developed a candidate vaccine 3 days later. We had been working with Moderna on, I think it was a Zika vaccine using this messenger RNA platform. We talked to them and said, because you can manufacture messenger RNA a lot easier because it's a chemical synthesis, not a protein growth product. And we partnered with them. 8 weeks later, we were in the human clinic, in human arms. Never before in history, fastest time in history, in 8 weeks to be in the human clinic. And then we, of course, developed all the others. So we had, that was a reason to believe. Another reason to believe is it's a vaccinable target. So, you know, no HIV AIDS, we've been working 50, 60 years to try to get a vaccine against HIV AIDS. Why is that such a challenge? It's a challenge because the human body cannot cure itself of HIV AIDS. It can't mount a defense. COVID, most of us, thank God, our body mounts a defense and we survive it.
If anything, it's a hyperinflammatory disease.
Exactly. And so it's what we call a vaccinable target. All I've got to do is trick your body into thinking it got COVID, so it produces antibodies to COVID, embeds that in your memory T cells and B cells. And the idea is then when you do see COVID, your B cells and T cells say, I've seen you before, I know exactly what to do, I don't have to spend time thinking about that and slowly ramp up antibody production. I go like this, build up antibody production and mount the defense right away. And so it's vaccinable. We just have to trick the body into thinking it's gotten COVID. And we had 100 candidates by the time we launched Operation Warp Speed. So it became a bit more of an issue of execution, brute force, execution, resources, de-risking, and changing the pharma timelines, which normally would be very risk-averse and hesitant, and flipping the incentive structures around to move faster. The other thing we were able to do is massive clinical trials. With that money, we had some of the largest vaccine clinical trials in human history, 30,000 people in them. What does that do? How do you test a therapeutic? You know, how do you test if a therapeutic works for FDA? Yeah, you find someone who's sick and you give them the therapeutic, and do they get better? That's how you test it. Well, we're sort of odd, big audience here, I can't really, but how do you test a vaccine? A lot of times the answer is, well, you give them the vaccine and then you put some COVID under their nose and you see if they get sick or die. That's not how you test. Maybe there are countries on Earth where that's ethically permissible, but that is not, that's called a human challenge study. That was not something that we would do here. What you do is you get volunteers and you give half of them basically a saline water placebo injection and half of them get the vaccine. And then you say, go forth into the world and call us if you get sick. And you have a pre-specified number of people who have to get sick to be a statistically significant endpoint. I think ours was about 104 with 30,000 people in the trial. You get to 104, and that's when you open up the black box and you say, oh, of that 104, how many of them got COVID? How many of the ones that got COVID were vaccinated, and how many got placebo? And those are your clinical trial results. So the more people you have, the faster you go. That's not cutting corners. It's just having many more shots on goal to get a faster result. And we had very high disease burden in that summer of 2020. So we had a lot of cases. a lot of our, so sorry to go on, but
No,
that's,
that's
somehow
it's
we
important
did it.
to share that with people. One thing I want to, in a sense, fast forward to a little bit in the story is at kind of the tail end of Paul Mango's book, he talks about in the incredible collaboration with the Army to get the vaccine, and with the pharmacies, with CVS and Walgreens, to get the vaccine into people, because they had the mastery of logistics. Both the military did, because they have incredible expertise in logistics, and these big pharmacies for comparable reasons. And so you had done all this work, you handed it off to the Biden administration, and there was this period of time when no one was getting shots, or when it just suddenly slowed down because the new administration claimed or argued that the plans that you had handed them were vaporware. Tell us about that transition and what exactly happened there.
Well, this sort of ties into FREOPP and also the Frederick Douglass Award, which is respecting and harnessing and enhancing the private sector of innovation. This whole thing was a public-private partnership. There are 3 Ps in that. That last one, partnership, is critical. You can't view your partner as an enemy if you're going to have a public-private partnership. You actually have to be willing to collaborate and work together and respect that each have interests and needs. I mean, these are not nonprofit organizations, for instance. The other thing about respecting the market is what we in business would call minimizing execution risk, and that was one of the key objectives we had. You make mistakes when you do something new. Repeated processes, doing over and over again what you know how to do and have done before, minimizes execution risk. Well, we have wholesalers in this country, Amerisource, McKesson, and Cardinal, that are the world's best wholesalers. They distribute medical product in this country with complete precision. We have the world's best actual shipping companies and distributors, FedEx, UPS. They do more than deliver your Amazon packages, trust me. They do white glove, very sensitive delivery with perfect on-time, temperature control, et cetera. We have pharmacies. I get my vaccines at the pharmacy. That's where we vaccinate. Use them. Don't build something new that could break. Use what's repeatable, tried and true, done. That's respecting the private sector. And frankly, we had worked for 6 months with, there are, I think, 62 public health departments in the country, each state, territories, and then some cities like Chicago, Philly, New York have their own. We had worked and actually developed very concrete distribution plans because we were deferring to them. We weren't going to tell them how to distribute vaccines or how to prioritize within their state because these are just too big a judgment calls that need to be made at a local level and sensitive to unique local conditions. But we had worked back and forth on these plans. I mean, these were extensive, deep plans. So it was a bit offensive when people would say, oh, there wasn't a plan. Oh, there was most certainly a plan. And by the way, that's literally what they just carried on doing. I think to the team, it was quite hurtful that there was that political verbiage because we were very apolitical in every aspect of this program and in ensuring the handoff, the transition between the administrations. And listen, they added value. I think especially with vaccine-hesitant communities and minority communities, they did an exceptionally good job. So we didn't see levels of African American, Native American, Hispanic vaccine hesitancy that we were very worried about and were planning for. And they did a great job with that. They added mass distribution centers in addition to pharmacies, which is something that on January 12th we actually said we were open to states doing, but they went full force, and I think that worked out great in many communities. So I think it was actually more continuous there than certain people would like to say or believe. But yeah,
that's encouraging. You mentioned the transfer power. President Trump, when he was campaigning this time around, and also in perhaps the intervening 4 years, according to things he said and also reports that have been out there, that he was surprised by how, when he tried to tout Operation Warp Speed as one of his, if not his administration's greatest accomplishments, he either got no applause or even, if anything, kind of a negative reaction. What's that been like for you, and what's your sense of that, the atmosphere in the country on this topic?
I will say, we did a lot of planning thinking about the traditional issues of vaccine hesitancy that you would face. I mentioned some, but there are also certain communities, upper northwest of the United States, Austin, Texas, parts of Brooklyn, New York, that have real significant pockets of vaccine hesitancy where we've seen risk of measles outbreaks and things before. So we were very focused on that. We, to my memory, didn't have a single discussion worrying about sort of rural, working class, red voters and whether they'd be vaccine hesitant or not. I would take an anthropologist to get to the bottom of it. I haven't fully understood. I do think, we're in a, I think at least a generational, if not a centennial type political realignment that's happening where traditional notions of Democratic and Republican constituencies are dramatically changing.
We've been talking about that.
Yeah, and I mean, so I think we're not there yet, but I think over time Democrats are going to be much more of a corporatist type, frame, big business, big company, big academia, sort of big, clustered together, very coastal, very elite educated, et cetera. And Republicans, where a lot of those key constituencies would traditionally have been sort of the big pharma, big insurance, big, is now much more, I think, the party of small and sort of individual populism, and in fact, a healthy, sometimes unhealthy, distrust of institutions, distrust of the establishment, and that's really that's a major shaking up. And of course, that distrust is what then will lead to things like, if you're suspicious of drug companies, suspicious of government institutions, that's going to feed into issues of hesitancy around information. I think that there was so much. My best advice for you, if you're going to have a pandemic, don't do it in a presidential year. Some of the verbiage around the vaccines there, and I don't want to cast stones, but I mean, there were people.
Kamala Harris said, "If Trump tells me to take the vaccine, I'm not going to take it." I think that's a direct quote.
Yep. There were people in September, October, basically saying that if a vaccine comes out, a Trump vaccine, basically they won't take it. You had some governors who actually said they wouldn't allow distribution of a Trump vaccine, even if it's FDA approved in their state. New York, most notoriously, California, several others. And that gets undermining of those institutions and sort of undermining of the credibility. So I can't get fully to the bottom. I'm very worried about it, though. I'm very worried about this kind of the vaccine hesitancy for the issues for the future, because I do believe vaccines have been some of the greatest public health tools of modern time and have saved countless millions of lives. I mean, Commonwealth Fund, which is no friend of a Trump administration, they said that Operation Warp Speed saved 3 million American lives and I think over 12 million lives around the world. The International Monetary Fund said that for every 24 hours that a vaccine came sooner, it saved $26 billion.
Wow.
Which, interesting, was the cost of the program. 26 billion was the cost of Operation Warp Speed. So literally, in one day, we achieved a repayment of what we spent.
I'd be remiss if, we obviously are having a presidential transition right now. There is a nominee for HHS secretary. We'll see whether he gets confirmed or not. But you've obviously served in the role. What have you learned from both being deputy secretary and now being HHS secretary in terms of, first of all, what would you tell? What's your best advice to a future HHS secretary about what the job entails, how to be effective in the role?
It's really one of the largest scale management executive jobs on earth. And like I said, if it were a nation, HHS is the 6th largest nation on earth. US, China, Japan, Germany, France, HHS, $1.4 trillion. At various points, 3 times the size of the Defense Department, a third of the US government, 85,000 employees, and God knows how many contractors. You're running the world's largest insurance companies, the world's largest biomedical research institutions, the regulator of 1/4 of every consumer dollar spent in the United States, the world's largest epidemiological organization, massive management leadership challenge. So I think it helps to bring skills from large-scale leadership to the table. And that comes down to really having clarity around your mission, your vision for where the organization is going, And where are you trying to go? What's the strategy? What are you trying to achieve? And so building consensus and alignment among your team and within the administration around the direction you're going. It's often like, it's like those crew boats, racing down here on the Potomac, and the coxswain is there getting the beat so everybody is in sync. If you're not in sync, the boat's going like this, and it's not getting where it needs to go. If everybody's in sync and aligned, the boat can actually go there quickly. And that was warp speed. That was critical to how we led in warp speed. Getting that alignment is vital, getting your team aligned, and then having execution frameworks to achieve it, to actually how do we get from here to there. Then you've got issues of stakeholder management and really understanding that as a secretary or as a CEO, you have the media, Congress, the West Wing, cabinet colleagues, public interest groups, industry groups, our stakeholders. And that stakeholder management, that connectivity, the listening is critical because you do not know it all. 330 programs, I don't care how long you've been there, you don't know it all. You have to have an open door. You have to listen to people. I've been involved with insurance companies, but I don't know how to run an insurance company the way somebody who runs an insurance company does. I've been at a pharma company, and I don't know how to run it as well as somebody who's still running a pharma company. You have to understand, the microeconomics of that stuff. You have to seek input, or you will make catastrophically bad decisions around regulations or legislation because you don't know how the private sector works, and you'll foot fault on that.
The slogan that a number of people in the Trump administration are using about healthcare is "Make America Healthy Again." What levers does the HHS secretary have on things like diet and exercise versus running Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera? And in general, as kind of a follow-up, part two of that question is, what are the things that people should know about the role of the HHS secretary and the power that the HHS secretary has on policy?
Well, I'll start with the second first. The HHS secretary role is incredibly powerful. Almost every single authority of HHS says the secretary shall. It doesn't say the low-level bureaucrat at FDA shall. Whatever anybody does at HHS is done by virtue of my and my predecessors' signatures delegating my authority to them to do that. So if FDA approves a drug, they approve a drug because I have allowed them to approve a drug. It is my authority. So that's an immense amount of power. And you can intervene, you can use that for good or ill. But that being said, that does not make one unaccountable. In the executive branch, there is a president. In the same way that all the power of HHS is given to the secretary, in the Constitution, the Article 2 doesn't say there is the executive power of the United States is vested in a cabinet or in a bunch of bureaucrats. It says the executive power of the United States is vested in the president of the United States, one person. And so there are processes built around what those who work at that individual's pleasure do. So you don't unilaterally use all those powers. You work with the Domestic Policy Council, the National Economic Council, of course, your overlords at OMB. You can't wipe your nose without getting permission from OMB.
The Office of Management and Budget.
You have Congress and appropriators. You have that write the checks. You have your authorizers, the people who give you your power and can take your power away. So all of this, you may think you have a lot of power when you're me, but you are actually operating in a very process-based, often consensus-based, matrixed system and organization where you have to bring people along if you wish to be able to exercise your power this way or that. In terms of the concrete things, you certainly have the bully pulpit. But as Secretary of Health, you certainly can drive a debate. What you prioritize has a big difference. What you spend your time on drives this massive bureaucracy. So if you say, as I did, that preserving the free market healthcare system in the United States by transitioning from paying for sickness to paying for value is what matters most, then the whole system is aligned around changing Medicare, Medicaid, and Obamacare to how do we pay for value and stop paying for sickness. That was me. That's because I said that's where we're going, and the president and White House were aligned with that, and so that's what we did. Different secretaries can prioritize different things and really drive action there.
And reflecting back now, how do you feel about how much you were able to accomplish, and what would you tell your 2016 or 2018 self about the job, other than don't have a pandemic during a presidential year?
Exactly. I think we accomplished a great deal. I mean, I think our team did some of the most revolutionary, transformative things in healthcare in history. Whether it's the value-based transformation of healthcare, changing those payment systems and how we do things, whether it's moving to on substance use disorder to a mindset of treating people who have addiction with the gold standard of medication-assisted therapy and making that available, which was a complete transformation in our thought processes. Whether it was the ending the HIV epidemic program, which in 10 years we could have gotten rid of. We have all the tools to end HIV as an epidemic. The current administration is really not focused on that. I hope that will come back. We have the chance to, so many things we transformed. We had a rule that actually would have changed the entire rebate system on drug pricing, would have completely changed the pricing dynamic and caused drug prices to go down overnight by, on average, 35%.
I agreed with you on that. I wrote about it at the time.
So we did a lot, got a lot done. I think in retrospect, it is very difficult, that alignment issue, getting it, keeping it, and having constancy is very hard. Because you have power centers, personalities, independent agendas. Not everyone who goes into an administration is saying, as I would often say to my team, listen, I may have a different view than the president, but guess what? One of us got elected president and one of us didn't. And so he wins, absent, as long as it's ethical, appropriate, not, legal, constitutional, but, respecting that as opposed to pursuing an independent agenda. Yeah.
What is the thing that you hope the next HHS secretary is able to accomplish over the next 4 years?
I do hope we continue the transformation of our payment systems. It's vital. Because I do worry if we don't fix how we pay for healthcare and every other part of the American economy, quality goes up and cost goes down every year. And if we keep going on the path we're going, I do fear that we will at some point get to the point where people say, enough with this private sector thing. Just give me the British National Health Service or something, because it'll cost less. Yeah, the quality and access won't be as good, but frankly, it's not great now. So that's why I think if we wish to preserve a free market system for healthcare and the type of access that we all value, the choice, the competition that we prize, we have to actually make that work and make that dream real, regardless of zip code. Really have to democratize that choice, competition, and access. And that involves changing to paying for value over paying for sickness. So I hope that is prioritized and focused on. I hope we continue to be the world's leader in biopharmaceutical innovation. We dominate the world in new therapies. I mean, we literally are at one of the most historic pivot points in innovation for in the history of human health. So it's now 24 years ago that we decoded the human genome. Our understanding of the molecular genetic nature of disease is now so supremely sophisticated that we can develop therapies that we know are going to work. And really what we're studying is just does it have some kind of what we call an off-target effect where it does something bigger than what we thought. And for instance, I met a kid when I was secretary, 19 years old, went into Children's Hospital, sickle cell anemia. 1 month later, left the hospital, didn't have a sickle in his blood. I mean, transformed his life, will save millions and millions and millions of dollars to the healthcare system. An absolute miracle, a complete transformation. And that's happening every day, new things like that. And it's not that these are just the yearly developments. This is now happening across the board because of all of that in knowledge that we have. And so my hope is we continue to support, we sponsor, we generate, and we pay for those innovations, because I think if we do, the people in this room, you're going to live longer, you're going to live healthier, and your kids are certainly going to.
Secretary Alex Azar, congratulations again. Thanks for being here.
Thank
you.
you.
Appreciate it.